Storytime. I began writing on the internet under my own name in May of 2011. I was 19 and had just finished my first year at Sarah Lawrence College, where I would ultimately tell people I studied film production and journalism. It came about somewhat circuitously. I had considered applying to Flixist.com, the newly formed film sister site to then favorite gaming blog Destructoid, the previous year, and I even began writing a pair of submission essays on the devastating violence of Park Chan-wook's Vengeance trilogy and what exactly is wrong with Christopher Nolan's approach to fight scenes. But I never submitted them. Still, I read the site, and when I decided for my final film history paper to dig into how video games had influenced cinema in more fundamental ways than terrible adaptations, I was able to convince my very serious and very British professor that I should be able to interview people, since academic scholarship on the topic was, shall we say, light. I sent a blind email to the Flixist team asking if anyone would be willing to talk about it, and I was pointed to the film that would basically become the thesis, Neville Dean and Taylor's Crank. Afterwards, I sent a draft of my paper over to them because I was exactly arrogant enough about the whole thing to think that they might be interested in it. But as it turns out, they were, and editor-in-chief Matthew Razak actually offered suggestions on how to improve it. Not long after, they asked if I wanted to come aboard as a news writer. And so it began. I quickly shifted away from news, though, and focused on honing my critical voice. A few years later, I became reviews editor and revamped the site's scoring system to the same 100-point scale that I still use today right here on this channel. And though eventually I parted ways with the site due to life, I am eternally grateful for the time I spent there and the myriad lessons I learned and the so many films I got to see that I otherwise probably wouldn't have even heard of. Hello, by the way, and welcome to the Week I Review. My name is Alec Kubas-meyer, and today I am talking about the best films of the decade. But first, some ground rules. A list like this is inevitably a fool's errand. No one has seen every movie, or even every good movie, and as soon as your list leaves a particular country, doing so becomes even more impossible. And there's also the issue of best not being clearly defined. Is it my favorite? The most perfectly crafted? How about the most important? How do I even gauge importance when the decade is just now ending? That only comes with years of hindsight. Now, I fully expect to learn in 10 years that no movie will have been more significant this decade than Avengers Endgame, or maybe The Lion King for all the wrong reasons. Whatever it is almost certainly a Disney movie, as though anything isn't these days. And yet, this list is entirely devoid of Disney movies, or even Disney-owned properties. Oops. It's also got nothing released in the past 365 days. There were some fantastic movies in 2019, but it was not a notably better year for cinema than any other, and yet many of these sorts of lists look more like best movies 2016 to 2019 than complete accountings of the decade. And so I've made an effort to ensure that the list encompasses everything, and part of the way to do that is to just take 2019 out of the running. Making that slightly easier is that I've also removed from consideration anything that I've already reviewed on this channel. Parasite, for example, is showing up on lists all over the damn place, and possibly, though not necessarily rightly so. But I talked about that long enough. Same for Spring Breakers, which would 100% be on this list were this rule not in place. However, I won't be limiting myself from movies that I have reviewed for Flixist or any other publication, and indeed, I have written about many of them because I saw most in my capacity as a critic. This because of the biggest limitation of them all. No country gets represented more than once, including the United States. I love international cinema, and I want to celebrate it. Lastly, this is not in any kind of bestness order, despite the fact that I have a weekly updated page where I rank everything I've reviewed. I don't want to try to rank these against each other, so instead, I'm going to go through them in a kind of narrative order, connecting them thematically in my head as best as I can. Honorable mentions will be sprinkled throughout, most of which are American. Again, placement should not be seen as a statement of relative quality. And now, let's get to the list. I remember leaving the theater after seeing David Fincher's The Curious Case of Benjamin Button and hearing a woman behind me furiously say to her partner, "What even happened?" And I wanted to turn around and shout, "A life happened." I didn't do that, but I had that feeling after watching Boyhood, though in a much more visceral way, as I walked out of the theater awestruck that this wild idea of a movie shot over 12 years had actually worked. It seemed like a singular cinematic event that would never be replicated, because who would even consider trying to do something like this again? Hell, in a world where digital de-aging is now just standard practice, who would feel the need to? It is true that if you watch a long-running TV show, you see something like this. You watch kids grow up and adults get old, but that happens over years rather than a matter of hours. In each new scene of Boyhood, Mason is visibly older, not just as a character, but as a person. There's no makeup or costume trickery. That little boy, Eller Coltrane, is now an adult, and I watched it happen. It's amazing. And then Richard Linklater had to go and announce his 20-year production of the musical Merrily We Roll Along. So Boyhood has gone from achievement to experiment, and so it goes from one of the decade's best to a mere honorable mention. I've mentioned before on this channel that I have a really intense kinship with coming-of-age dramedies about teenage girls, and Joseph Kahn's Detention was like my gateway drug. And for most of this decade, I, perhaps too proudly, proclaimed it to be my favorite movie of all time. Kahn is best known for making a lot of your favorite music videos from back in the day, and basically all of Taylor Swift's good videos since Blank Space. But he also has a few movies under his belt, and they are all wild, and very clearly made by a talented music video director. Detention has one of the best licensed soundtracks ever, something that apparently would have cost more than the rest of the film combined had Kahn needed to go through the typical channels. Fortunately, he was able to call in a whole lot of favors, and the music is really what ties this decade-spanning epic together. Detention is a little bit of everything: drama, comedy, sci-fi, slasher horror, etc. And it successfully melds all these things together in a way that really struck me as someone who was at the time recently out of high school. Although completely outlandish, it was one of the first films that I really felt like captured the experience of being the first generation to grow up with the internet, and what a strange world that was. In an interesting twist, I have it on good authority that my review of this film also played a significant role in my being selected as part of the inaugural New York Film Festival Critics Academy back in 2012, and that's dope. More recent movies like Lady Bird, The Edge of 17, 8th Grade, and Booksmart also understand younger folks and do so in brilliant ways that I love. They are some of my favorite movies of the past 10 years, even if I'm now too old to truly identify with most of them. But none of them have time-traveling bears, so they're not on this list. On the note of coming-of-age stories, Blue is the Warmest Color is a movie I have seen only once, but have thought about bare minimum every other month for more than 6 years. On a list that includes a Holocaust drama and mentions a documentary about death squad leaders, spoiler, it affected me the most. Heck, it is possibly the movie that affected me the most all decade, and that's because I don't feel great about specific ways in which I relate to its protagonist, Adele. Blue is the Warmest Color has a lot going on. 2 of those things are bad, and the rest are all really, really good. The pair of exhaustingly long sex scenes that drew all of the initial controversy are irritating because they're just artistically uninteresting and don't push things forward in any way. They happen, and it's a slog, made all the more frustrating by the fact that there are 2 other scenes where sex plays directly into character development, and those scenes are amazing. blue is the warmest color makes for a really useful case study in how and how not to use sex in your movie. But none of that is why this film is on the list. No, it's on the list because of the fight between Adele and Emma that effectively serves as the film's climax. Emma confronts her about her infidelity, and we are subjected to 10 minutes of pain. I saw it at the New York Film Festival screening, which had an accompanying Q&A, and someone asked about this scene. According to its lead actress, also named Adele, the scene was actually an hour long, shot continuously with 2 cameras, and we got the cut-down version. I cannot even fathom what that complete scene would have done to me, because even abbreviated, it has been burned into my fucking psyche, and I don't think it'll ever get out. While the pseudo-coming-of-age film Spring Breakers is the highest-rated thing on the week I review, the Raid 2 Barandal is my highest-rated thing ever. And for a long time, my most successful video on YouTube wasn't on this channel, but rather was a discussion for Flixist about my decision to score the Raid 2 a 97 out of 100. It's a rather old video and of substantially lower quality than I would ever accept on this channel, but I rewatched it while writing this and found it actually pretty interesting. As I said, the way I approach numerical scoring hasn't really changed. So if you've ever been curious about the way I approach the quantification of things, especially towards the higher end of the scale, what I said then largely remains true today. What makes the Raid 2 so amazing is its technical polish. Gareth Evans is a genuinely capable dramatic director who also happens to be one of the best working action directors. His camera is a genuine inspiration to me and did more than anything else to inspire the way I have approached filming fight scenes in my own movies. It also appropriately ratchets up the scale from the perfectly paced but limited in scope original. There's a fair question about whether this really makes for a better movie on the whole, but the massive leap in quality of production around those amazing fights is so stark that I can't help but rather watch the latter's fight scenes if I have the choice. You know, it may not be on the level of a John Wick Parabellum with its tens of millions in Hollywood backing, but as much as I love Keanu Reeves, he's no Iko Uwais. The 2-on-1 against Yan Yan Ruhian and Sesep Rahman, who are in the Raid 2 at the end of Parabellum, was instructive here because you could see how they had to hold back against the Baba Yaga. They do no such thing in the Raid 2. It's just pure martial arts intensity, and it's incredible. Nearly 6 years ago now, I called The Raid 2 the best action movie of all time. It's probably not true, but it is absolutely the best martial arts movie of the decade. Mad Max Fury Road is very probably the best action movie of all time. It has the pacing of the first Raid film, but it's a car chase. The greatest 2-hour car chase imaginable. It's basically a perfect movie. My strongest memory of the first time I saw Fury Road was the breath I took at its first moment of pause, when we finally see the title screen. The realization that I had been basically holding it in from the word go. This was opening night. I went with some folks I didn't know very well and felt immediately bonded to all of them. I proceeded to see it 3 more times before it left theaters, including another with that original group. And each time I had that same moment with that same deep breath, because it is impossible to not get caught up in that relentless momentum. And that's just the beginning. It is such an immensely imaginative film, one that constantly throws new and amazing things at you. You can never guess what's coming next, because whatever you were expecting, George Miller is 3 steps ahead. The man is a straight-up genius. And the narrative economy is unreal. So much is told with so little that it makes sense that Miller's favorite version of the film has no dialogue at all. It's a black and white silent movie, but presumably with the sounds of the cars and explosions and etc. all retained. Capitalizing on part of that, the special edition Blu-ray does include the black and chrome version that keeps the dialogue but cuts out the color. It is absolutely worth watching once, but I don't think it's better without that intensely contrasting color. Look, I am as bored of that orange and cyan combination as the next guy, but Miller and co. succeeded in actually making that look unique and beautiful and integral to Fury Road's overall effect. Also, much of the movie was shot day for night, and without blue color there to trick your mind, it looks a lot like daytime, which is awkward. But that's neither here nor there. Mad Max Fury Road is a staggering achievement, and nothing else this decade even came close. Well, almost nothing. Christopher Nolan has long fought for a kind of pure cinema experience, from his commitment to shooting on film in general to his eventual commitment to shooting on large format film, either 65mm or even IMAX film itself. With Dunkirk, a full 3/4 of the movie was shot on the latter, and seeing it in 70mm IMAX was a genuine highlight of my decade, at least as far as time spent in the movie theater goes. There really isn't anything quite like the experience of a cinematic event that takes up the entirety of one of the largest screens in the entire world for most of its runtime. And while individual moments are less mind-boggling than some of Nolan's more fantastical works like Inception or Interstellar, taken as a whole, it is arguably beyond all of them. The real reason Dunkirk isn't on this list proper is because the movie was hampered by its need to work in multiple formats. Of course, the ideal way to see it is with that 1.43:1 IMAX aspect ratio, but many digital IMAX screenings cut off the tops and bottoms, which were cut even further by 65mm prints and further still for the 35mm and DCPs. By the time you get to their 2.4:1 aspect ratio, a full 40% of the vertical image has been removed. There's no doubt that every single moment is more amazing when you can see the complete image, but the decision to work that way inherently limits the filmmaker's abilities. Everything of critical importance must be in that smallest frame, meaning there are plenty of times where there's really nothing going on above or below. It's kind of immersion for the sake of immersion. And while this is true for every Hollywood production that is shot partially in IMAX and gets cropped for mass audiences, Dunkirk being more IMAX than not makes it feel different. It's not like a couple of scenes that just give bragging rights for true fans. It's the way the entire movie was always completely intended to be seen. So where were my close-ups the size of an apartment building, guys? Maybe next time. Another type of cinematic spectacle is being represented here by a much smaller movie. While other films on this list make heavy use of long takes, I think it is worth devoting an entire entry to the concept of the oneer. While long takes are as old as cinema, extremely long ones have become much more prevalent in recent years because digital technology makes it possible to just keep rolling forever on the one hand, while also aiding in the faking it process on the other. In fact, the last big budget release of this decade is Sam Mendes's acclaimed World War I film 1917, which presents itself as an unbroken camera move, though it is definitely not actually that. Despite what Mendes says, these sorts of long takes, fake or not, are absolutely a gimmick. But I reject the notion that gimmicks are inherently bad. 3D is also a gimmick, but the last third of Doctor Strange made it worthwhile. In a much more serious way, so did Alfonso Cuarón's Gravity, which also features a 17-minute long opening shot. Christopher Nolan's use of IMAX is ultimately a gimmick too, but so what? It's about how you use the gimmick to tell the story that matters. Unlike 1917 or Birdman, etc., which mask cuts in whip pans and the like, Victoria genuinely plays out in real time for more than 2 freaking hours. Seriously, it is a 130-plus minute single shot following a young Spanish woman named Victoria who is living and working at a cafe in Berlin. One fateful night, while out dancing, she runs into some local hoodlums that can't afford to get into the club and ends up going out with them. Things go awry when they get pulled into a heist to pay back a dangerous man, and she comes along as well. It is fascinating. In reality, Victoria is probably the least good movie on the list, but it's also the only one that I would consider worth an entire semester of college study. Any of these movies deserves at least a couple of seminars of discussion, but you could dedicate a full course to Victoria because it teaches so much about what does and doesn't work in movies. One thing that makes it specifically compelling, especially compared to other things like it, is how much movement there is around the city. Folks take bikes and cars and walk and run around to a wide variety of locations. It's like a filmed piece of immersive theater where the set is Berlin. That's fantastic. And it makes me want to go to Berlin. But the flip side is that because there is a fair amount of time spent in transit between primary locations, not much is really happening. And because the movie can't cut, it's sometimes boring for a few minutes. Characters make small talk, at least some of which must be ad-libbed because it would have been impossible to perfectly time it all out, and you wish that they would just go to the next scene. But eventually it does, and things pick back up, and then an hour later, the driver misses a turn, and everyone in the car freaks out, and the intensity of the moment is kind of alarming. It turns out that was a genuine mistake, and she actually missed her mark, and we're too damn far into this thing to stop now. It would never make it into a regular film, but it stays here. And every so often, you get one of those beautiful moments where it strikes you that you have been with these people this entire time. It creates a level of reality that would be impossible to capture any other way. Because even though it is all scripted out and no one is actually getting shot or whatever, it is actually happening. And for more than 2 hours, we bear witness to it. On the note of bearing witness, Roma, better than any film I have ever seen, captures the experience of trying to just live one's life while the world is in turmoil. I saw a late showing just a few hours after my screening of Salo or the 120 Days of Sodom, so it had been a long day and I was exhausted. For the first hour or so of the pristine 70mm print I was seeing, I honestly had a little trouble keeping my eyes open. But then a threat of violence woke me the fuck up, and that jolt turned out to be a sustained voltage that kept me wired for the remainder of the film and into the hours that followed. The two made for an unexpectedly compelling double feature, though sadly we are now too far removed from the experience for me to clearly articulate why. The truth is, I went in knowing who had made Roma and how beloved it was, but that was pretty much it. And it was so much more movie than I thought. What makes the film so significant is its choice of protagonist. Cleo is a housekeeper for a wealthy family. She is incredibly normal and lives a normal life, one that only occasionally intersects with all of the wild things that are happening around her. I talked in my Parasite review about how one of Bong Joon-ho's greatest strengths is his ability to use background action to make the world feel alive. Cuarón has always been very good at this as well, but Roma is on a whole other level. As we follow Cleo through her days, there's just so much going on behind that is always just a little bit out of focus, such that we can see generally what it is, but miss the details. Big, elaborate sets and heavily choreographed movements featuring wild numbers of extras happen in the blink of an eye, and then they're gone. It's the kind of thing that seems impossible in a movie because no one would allow so much money to be spent on a big set piece you can't even see clearly, right? So when Cleo walks by someone being shot out of a cannon on the way to meet her boyfriend, that must simply be the real world they just got lucky enough to capture while making a traditional drama. Movies tend to be about the most interesting thing that's happening, so it is usually the case that whatever draws your eyes on screen is the thing you're supposed to be focused on. Roma doesn't work like that. Cuarón seemingly looked at the people trying to avoid that thing, closed his eyes, pointed a finger, and then made a movie about whomever he was pointing at. Cleo is the innocent bystander with a tragic, beautiful story that no one makes movies about. But thankfully, we got her movie anyway. In 1945, British official Sidney Bernstein oversaw the creation of a documentary that wouldn't be finished for 70 years. Though parts of it would appear in television programs over the decades, it wasn't until 2014 that the complete film, known as German Concentration Camps Factual Survey, saw a release. The factual survey consists of more than an hour of footage taken from a number of such camps in the immediate aftermath of the liberation by soldiers and news people who were there filming the scenes that they came upon. You can see it on YouTube. I watched about half an hour while working on this. I don't have the words to articulate how it made me feel. It is a horror beyond comprehension. And that's the point. It was made that way with some supervisory help from one Alfred Hitchcock to ensure that no one could ever question what had happened during the Holocaust. And of course, it is real. Laszlo Nemes's Son of Saul, which released a couple of years after the factual survey's completion, is not real, but it was made with a similar intent. It is a drama set in Auschwitz, told from the perspective of a Jewish prisoner forced to work in the chambers. Saul is among the people bringing newcomers to them and then cleaning up after the fact. Like Victoria, the film stays with its protagonist throughout, and the shots are long too, but it all serves a radically different purpose here. Son of Saul is told entirely from the point of view of its lead, but it is one that has been intentionally limited. Saul wants to block out the things around him, and he does so for us. The image is a boxy 4x3, and Saul is in frame nearly always, taking up a huge portion of the screen. The depth of field is so shallow, meaning Saul is generally the only thing in focus, but the evil is still there in his peripheral, and you can see in the blur the implications of such acts, which is still plenty disturbing. And then there's the sound design, that impeccably designed and gut-wrenching track that he cannot drown out and never lets us forget where we are. Nemes and his creative team pushed for maximum authenticity in the production, including having the recreated crematorium be designed by an architect who worked at the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum. It feels grimy and lived in and heavily used. It's awful. Son of Saul may be a work of fiction, but it's so specifically crafted to make you feel the true horror of this place and this time in history. Its greatest triumph is its ability to convincingly put you there in it during the evil rather than in the aftermath. It is a gut-wrenching film, but especially in an era where right-wing fascism is on the rise again, a necessary one. The act of killing is as profound as it is boring. So read the first line of my capsule review of Joshua Oppenheimer's acclaimed documentary. The film documents the lives of former heads of death squads who took part in a massive genocide in 1960s Indonesia. I stand by what I said, but I missed the critical second part of that thought. The act of killing is profound in large part because it is boring. These people committed the worst atrocities and are celebrated for it. They just live their normal, boring lives, telling stories of the good old days like anyone else, except the stories from the good old days are indelibly seared into my memory and I fucking want them out. The broader premise of the film, give these men the opportunity to tell their stories in the form of short films, is fascinating, and I always felt like Oppenheimer should have used a bit more of their footage in the final film, but it's probably for the best that he didn't, because that adds a little too much glitz and glamour to the whole thing. The shorts make these people feel larger than life instead of the very real, I guess, technically humans that they are. And while that doesn't make for super interesting cinema, it does make for something incredibly important. I haven't seen its companion piece, The Look of Silence, yet. You know, it's fairly high up on the list of movies that I know I should see, but am never in the mood for. Even so, I'm sure it deserves a part in this slot as well. One of the newest films on this list is also the oldest. They Shall Not Grow Old is Peter Jackson's World War I documentary made using footage entirely from that time, which has been run through some mind-boggling film cleanup software and gone over by talented artists to bring the sound and color of the world back into it. It is a strange and utterly compelling combination of technical showcase and historical document, making me thoroughly invested in people from a time that I have never put the slightest effort into learning about. And I'll be honest, it did not instill within me some deep desire to better understand this era, but I did come out of it with a different kind of appreciation for what happened then. And certainly, I believe that it's crucial that such a thing exists and does so in this bizarrely high fidelity. I saw it in 3D too, and just thinking about what they had done was almost overwhelming. And of course, it makes you wonder about the possibilities of this technology. Jackson had already said he's using the same thing to restore some of his older films, which I am quite excited about. But there are so many other places this could go, from bringing any number of silent films into the new world to, say, doing this entire process to the aforementioned factual survey. But whatever happens, it does make me look forward to seeing the future of cinema's past. One of the highlights of my decade, right up there with seeing Dunkirk in 70mm IMAX, was watching the completed version of Shion Sono's Bad Film on the big screen at New York's Japan Society. The two movies could hardly be more different. Bad Film was shot in the mid-90s, long before Sono would arguably overtake Takashi Miike as Japan's premier auteur of oddities, on high-8 tape with a cast of literally thousands, the members of his performance art collective Ga Ga Ga. There were 150 hours of footage to sort through, and it became too expensive for him to finish back then. But nearly 20 years later, he looked back at what he had done and pulled out 161 minutes of strange and exhilarating imagery that coheres just enough to be brilliant. Bad Film feels like an extended joke. The movie almost certainly should have been left in whatever damp basement those tapes spent years degrading in as Sono went about working on other projects. But the fact that it not only wasn't left to completely rot, but actually saw some kind of release and was given a festival screening in New York City adds an air of prestige that the film doesn't deserve, but I'm so glad it got. This decade was big for Sono, a rather prolific filmmaker who has really come into his own. Some of the movies he's made are great and some a little less so, but they are always worth watching. My personal favorite from the past 10 years is 2014's Why Don't You Play in Hell, another masterpiece about the lengths a filmmaker will go to appease the movie gods that has a totally buck wild third act, and gosh, I just love it so much. And it originally held this spot on the list. Not Shion Sono, but One Cut of the Dead, which is also about making movies, was another contender. I think it's a little too inside baseball for its own good, though. I love it, but I know for a fact that it is a lot less fun for people who don't have a specific interest in the filmmaking process. The perfect Rotten Tomatoes score is not unjustified, but also people who become film critics are the exact sort of people that this movie is clearly targeting. But ultimately, my fondest memories are of Bad Film, a so bad it is perfect relic that shouldn't have seen the light of day, but makes the world a better place for having done so. This was a hard one. I've said before that I have a specific love for Korean cinema, something I developed during my time at Flixist, so there was never any question that that would be present here. But once I limited myself to a single option, I had no idea where to go from there. So, in kind of the same way I did with Detention, I ended up sidestepping the issue entirely by going with a film that played an outsized role in my own critical development, Jang Chol-soo's Bedeviled. Korea is known for its revenge thrillers, and Bedeviled is right up there with the Vengeance trilogy and I Saw the Devil at the top of the heap. It is a deeply painful, beautifully rendered film, which makes sense when you find out that Jong had previously worked as an assistant director for Kim Ki-duk, whose reputation precedes him, I think. His 2002 film The Isle has a scene in which a woman puts a collection of fish hooks into her vagina, so that's a lot. And Jung definitely seems to have picked up on the inner workings of bleak, artistic ultraviolence. But the reason I chose it is because Bedeviled was one of the first films I ever reviewed in a semi-professional capacity, and it was the first time I had to have a conversation about my score with the editors, because I believed it deserved above a 90 out of 100. Looking back, it's a bad review. Poorly structured, poorly written, saying absolutely nothing of any value, and I'm slightly ashamed to have written it, but it was a milestone, and it helped to put me on the path that I'm still on all these years later. And so we've come to the final entry. I'm putting Thelma last because, unlike every other movie on this list, the reason it deserves to be here is fundamentally a spoiler. And I want to give you the opportunity to go watch the film before I tell you what it's actually about, because what follows is the way I justified one of the biggest limitations I placed on this list. And I say all that knowing that if you do go, you're probably not going to come back. So you've made it this far. You've gotten the entire list. Congratulations, you can go off contentedly knowing everything that's on it, including Thelma, and once you've watched it, you'll understand why. Maybe you can come back and hear me talk about it, but if not, that's okay. Thanks for making it this far. Thelma is here because Marvel is not. It would be completely disingenuous to discuss the 2010s in cinema without talking about superheroes, because superheroes were the 2010s in cinema, for good and bad. But while the MCU was important because of its successes and the DCEU because of its failures, it was the side projects that I enjoyed the most. An earlier version of this list had Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and both Deadpool and Logan really impacted the way I feel about more traditional superhero movies. But the true best origin story of this decade was Thelma. Thelma's story wouldn't be out of place in the X-Men universe. A young woman realizes that she has powers after going off to college, and those powers allow her to do very bad things to unsuspecting people. But what none of us know is that her parents are aware of her capabilities, because when she was young, she unintentionally teleported her infant brother beneath the ice of the lake by their house to make him stop crying. And he drowned. In the film's opening moments, we see Thelma's father point a gun at her head. She is a child. She doesn't see it. He doesn't pull the trigger, and we don't know why, but it colors every interaction from then on. He is controlling. He's instilled in her conservative Christian values. We are against him, and we are scared of what he has done and might do to Thelma. Until we realize the story was kind of about him all along, or more specifically, about his decision to not pull that trigger at the beginning, and the horror that that decision would leave in its wake. Because Thelma is capable of much more than just teleporting people, and as the extent of her powers become known to us and her, we realize that she is the one to fear. In Batman vs. Superman, Ben Affleck says that if there is even a 1% chance that Superman is the enemy, they must take it as a certainty that he is an extinction-level threat and deal with him appropriately. But would he have said that if the superhuman was his daughter? What would he have done about it? And that's the question that makes the film so tragic, because of course Thelma's father didn't pull the trigger. But what then? Once she has control, Thelma doesn't use her powers for good. She uses them selfishly, like a teenager would. You could call it evil, but I don't know if that's quite right. At least not actively evil. Or maybe they are. I mean, it's hard to blame her given the circumstances, but maybe it isn't. Honestly, anytime I try to parse out my feelings on it, I just end up spiraling. I only know that there was no good outcome, just many shades of black. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you particularly to my patrons, my mom, Hamry and Marco, Kat Saracata, Benjamin Schiff, Anthony Cole, @Blasian FMA, Magnolia Denton, and Elliot Fowler. If you like this video, awesome. If not, fuck you. If you want to see more, please subscribe. Happy New Year. We did it. We made it through the decade. Whew. I hope to see you in the next one.